Is photography dead? Or is it completely meaningless just because of the number of photos that we're taking with all our devices these days? Find out more. Listen to my conversation with Alex Barash from the Stern Business School at New York University coming up next. Hi, Alex. Thank you very much for joining us today on the show. We normally start with just trying to find out a little bit about who you are and why you did this research. So how come you ended up on this topic?
Yeah, so actually, if I can get a little bit personal, I started thinking about these research ideas when I was living abroad before I even started my PhD. I traveled a good amount and did a Fulbright scholarship in Asia. So during my year there in Hong Kong and Macau and kind of going all over Asia, I took a lot of photos, probably as you might expect, thousands of photos. And I started to realize that the photo taking that I was doing was affecting my experience. And that was, both for better and for worse. There were times when photo taking was, really enhancing my experience and making me notice things I might not otherwise have seen and helping me take in my surroundings. And then there were other times where I was getting very stressed out by taking photos, and there were, anxieties that came with, thinking about all the photos that I would want to post and share with people. And so kind of going into grad school, I realized that I wanted to study that systematically. And I kind of started my PhD with these questions in mind and decided I wanted to, experimentally investigate, how does photo taking affect consumers and people's experiences more broadly, both, the enjoyment and their memories of the experience.
So that's interesting. You've touched upon lots of different things there. Some of the things that I noticed were the number of photos that we take these days, and that you noticed even before you started your course of study there on this topic. And the other thing, one was kind of like an internal experience of interruption. This idea that actually taking photos interrupted somehow your experience of engaging with whatever it is that you were taking a photo of.
Right.
And then there was also, I noticed you were talking about the anxieties around the sharing, well, how do I and who do I share this image and by default the experience with, and how you go about doing that, right? So there's quite a few different things that you've touched upon there. And in this paper, it's a really interesting paper I found, because you've got a series of 9 studies reported in this one paper. And in the setup of the paper, you talk about, your goal specifically is to understand whether the enjoyment of the experience itself is affected by whether or not people take photos. But there's a few theories underlying why that might be. And I was wondering if you could walk us through some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. We came at this from, again, a little bit like my own experience from the angle of we are researchers and we don't know which way it's going to go. And so we were open to seeing empirically, where the data would take us. But then theoretically, there was definitely research that could also, like my intuitions and own experience, could support both directions. And so it was, it's mostly focused around your point about interruption, but how that can actually go in the other way as well. So we use the term engagement in the paper. That's really, if you think about the psychological theory behind it, it's really more like an attention point. So when I'm taking photos, it's possible that they will, interrupt my experience, that they will cause me to be less engaged with the actual event or the experience itself, that I'll be thinking about the photos themselves instead of the experience. And I think a lot of people have that intuition that photos are kind of ruining our lives because we're so focused on that instead of, living. But the other side of the equation, and as you know, what we we ended up showing across, many studies, is that photo taking also can shift your attention in a way that is actually more immersive and engaging with the experience. So when I am deciding what photos to capture, I'm searching the visual field. I'm taking in content that I might not otherwise notice. The decision itself is very engaging, and these the psychological theory of attention and engagement and being in a flow state like that, it's just the more that you're doing those things during an experience, it's actually going to get you more involved, to get you to actually enjoy that experience more when it's a positive experience. So we sort of saw how the same theory could make predictions in both ways. And then we went in, I'd say, a little agnostic and said, let's see what the data says. And we've shown across, dozens of studies, not just the ones reported there, that, while for sure it definitely takes people out of experiences sometimes. And we have, studies in the paper showing the boundaries of this. That's for sure true, but for the most part, the modal and most common response is that photo taking actually enhances enjoyment of people's experiences.
I was very curious and examined my own experience when I was reading your paper, because I've been taking photos for a lot of my life. And right. What I notice is that even pre kind of smartphone photos and just the fact that this is just so available now, when I would use a camera to take photos of things, often I would, even for days afterwards, be looking at things in a particular way. I'd be looking to almost like trying to compose a shot. So I'd be, right. The way that I engage with, my environment changed quite a lot as a result of that. And I'd always be, as you say, a little bit agnostic around, I don't know whether that's good or bad, whether I'm kind of looking at it in this way or not. Maybe it's making me appreciate it in a different way, perhaps, than otherwise exactly. I would have done if I hadn't been kind of like in photo mode.
Right. I love that point. And it's your experience is consistent with some of the data we have in the paper, which shows that we can even get people to take mental photos, that it doesn't have anything to do with the physical act of pushing a button or taking the photo, that it is really about the attentional process, this, mental thing that we're doing, that we're engaging with the world differently. And I also really like your point that it's not necessarily good or bad, because we have another paper that looks at the memory process from photo taking, and there we show that, as you might expect from focusing on visual details, that photo taking can actually enhance our memory for visual content. But because it's, diverting energy and resources to visual, it takes away from our auditory capacity. And so we're less likely to remember auditory aspects of our experiences. Maybe that's, the person that you're talking to during your experience, or maybe it's the tour guide telling you about your experience. And so it's really a good point that you made that, this isn't, we try to stay away from, good or bad about photos, but we just have to realize that this mental process is reshaping the way we live our lives, the way we approach our experiences, the way we see things and hear things. And so that's pretty important. And I like your perspective on that.
And as you're talking, Alex, I'm sat there thinking, I wonder how short videos also map onto this, because you're talking about this kind of multimodality, and perhaps when we're taking photos, we're probably more dominated by that visual attention, and perhaps we're not paying as much attention to other things that are going on, so we don't have the chance to encode it in memory because we're not rehearsing it and we're not looking at it and attending to it. So if we're not paying attention to it, it doesn't go in, right? So we don't have the chance to remember it.
Yep.
And I wonder about videos. I wonder about those Instagram short videos, and maybe how does that work in terms of memory? Are you aware of anything around that?
So no work that I know of that has studied that specifically. I would say, based on our theory, that we can make very clear predictions about how video might operate. And to your point, when there's additional modalities, sensory modalities, then your attention will, have to divide between them. My favorite example of that is just thinking about, at a concert, the goal is oftentimes to hear the music and not to just see the singer or band. And so you can imagine video has both components, but you could also imagine recording, and recording would really shift your attentional resources to just the music, and photos are going to shift your attention to the set and the lights and the visual aspects. And so video is unique because it has both aspects, but for sure that's going to change your attention, and will probably come somewhere in between those other two modalities that we're capturing when we do it alone. So that's really cool. And we show in another paper that, it's really about the salience of one goal versus the other. So if I can really make the visual very salient, then that dominates. If I make auditory salient, that's going to dominate, and probably video is going to come somewhere in the middle.
And that salience, I guess, before we get into the studies, I guess I was also interested in your introduction when you were talking about this. I guess it relates to this idea of multiscreening. People kind of like watching TV, but also perhaps posting on Twitter or on Facebook on the actual site of that show that they're watching, and engaging with content or with people or with chat at the same time.
Totally.
And I guess the purpose of that is to try to increase engagement with what's going on, but then you're also dividing attention across these two different ways of engaging with the show. And I guess that's an increasingly modern phenomena. We're seeing people multi-screening all the time now.
Yeah, totally. That's a good question. Something that multiple researchers are working on right now, and there's no paper out yet. But the interesting aspect of multi-screening that you brought up, that is, sort of multitasking, doing multiple things at once, that is definitely part of it, and it could be engaging to the extent that you're doing things that are related, but it could also be very distracting if you're trying to do too many different things. And the other piece is that oftentimes multi-screens come with social media and getting feedback on kind of the content that you're viewing. So, imagine watching a TV show or going through an experience where you're texting about it or sharing about it or in a chat room about it or reading what people are saying on Twitter about it. So there you actually get this extra force of social connection, which is lots of psychology has shown is a very good thing. So it could be that the multitasking is detracting from it, but that the social connection really enhances it. So those are going to be some interesting forces that have to get teased apart in this new research.
I think that's an interesting point, but because I guess that that social connection assumes that the social connection is good, but often we find that actually you can get some really challenging and nasty stuff going on social media too, which then changes the emotional tone of your experience, which means that you may encode it and associate it in memory in different ways.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in this work, the who is the audience, who are the people that you're talking about really matters. And when you're talking with out-group members, or perhaps these are people who are more or less similar to you, that can really shift the conversation. You can imagine political views are something that people feel very strongly about, at least here, and so there, and in the anonymous world of the internet, it can definitely detract as well. So it'll be highly dependent on all of those things.
Yes. We're on a different show now, so let's get back to your study.
Right.
So your first 4 studies, you were looking at trying to examine the basic effect of photo taking on engagement and enjoyment, and you had some lab studies here and some field studies. So maybe you can just walk us through what you did and what you concluded from those first 4 studies.
Yeah, sure. So one of our favorite studies is the first study in the paper. That is because we actually hired a bus tour in Philadelphia to take students and other people who were part of the study on a real life bus tour of Philadelphia, where we hired a tour guide. The tour guide, had a script and said everything kind of exactly the same across conditions. We randomly assigned people on this bus tour. Every other hour to switch whether they could take photos during the bus tour or not. And we didn't make it so that we were like taking photos away from the control condition. We just said, okay, leave your belongings here, with us, because it's a study. And then the other people, we said, bring your actually we gave them cameras, so everybody would have one. And so bring your camera and take photos. And so we just had them kind of do a route around Philly that took about an hour, and they came back and they filled out a survey, and the survey asked them about their enjoyment of the experience, how engaged they were, as well as a few other items around their likelihood to recommend the experience to others and how much they felt like they learned. And all of these things sort of go together, where we find that those who were allowed or able to take photos during the experience, they enjoyed the experience more, that this was driven by the increased engagement or immersion with the bus tour. They also felt like they learned more and were more likely to recommend it. But really what we care about, is the enjoyment process. And then we sort of build on that in all of the remaining studies. We did something very similar at Reading Terminal Market, which is basically just like this, farmer's market in Philadelphia. Everybody has intuitions about what is all this photo taking doing to our meals, and everyone has to take a photo before they eat anything. So, okay, let's look at an eating experience. So we went to this farmer's market, and we just approached people at the tables where they were eating. We just told, again, we randomly assigned people to one of two groups. In the group that was the control condition, we didn't tell them anything. We just said, enjoy your experience as you normally would, and fill out the survey after you're done eating. In the other condition, we asked them to just take 3 photos of their food, and then again, eat your experience as you normally would, and then answer the survey. And so there we also find a similar effect, where those who took photos of their food actually report that they enjoyed the experience more. So kind of building on that, and you mentioned the lab studies, we've then moved to a lot of studies that are using our kind of virtual reality paradigm, where we have people in the lab going through a virtual experience from a first-person perspective. They watch a video, but it's kind of as if they're there. So, on top of a tour bus, or maybe they're scuba diving, or they're watching a concert. We have a number of different experiences, also safaris. So then they go through that experience, and our interface allows people to take photos. So that gives us a lot of control over the experience. Everybody sees the exact same experience, but we randomly assign people either to take photos or to not be able to take photos, just watch the video. And those who are able to take photos, again, they report that they enjoy the experience more. We measure immersion or engagement. And so that is, consistent evidence with the field data. But, here we get, just even greater control, because we're able to say, look, these two experiences were identical, but those who could take photos enjoyed it more. We get some evidence of the engagement process in another way, because you might be thinking, oh, well, this is all self-report, and people say different things when they're just reporting from their mind. But I really love this study where we go to the museum, and we actually have eye tracking data. And so we have people wear these goggles that track where their eyes are, and we find this evidence for our engagement process through people's eye movements, that they're more attentive to the artifacts in the museum instead of, other distractors, their surroundings, the floor, the ceiling, the other people. So when you're going through an experience with a camera, or like I said, even just like mentally thinking about what you want to capture, it actually changes what you look at. And that engagement process, that visual attention, is what's driving this greater enjoyment that we find consistently from self-report. So it's a really nice additional study that like demonstrates the mechanism of engagement or kind of visual attention through a physiological measure, which is people's fixations. What are they kind of really fixating on and attending to through in an experience?
I really like that part of the paper where you have this objective indicator where you're actually using eye tracking equipment to check where people are actually looking. And I think that really added something to the paper. But you also made me laugh around the, the whole Instagram experience of people taking photos of their food beforehand. And when I saw that study, I thought, yeah, this is what people do. This is really interesting.
Right.
Yeah. So your last set of studies, you were really looking at the sort of the role of engagement, how the act of photo taking may interfere or perhaps reduce the amount of enjoyment that people may have. What did you find there, and how did you go about looking at that?
Yeah, exactly. So, I totally see the paper the same way as you. So start off with this demonstration that photos can really enhance enjoyment. And then the last 3 studies look at the boundaries. And that's, like you pointed out, in the effort of showing this engagement piece. So, you can build on our theory and say, okay, well, if it's about engagement, then if you have a photo taking experience that is not engaging, then you shouldn't get the same effects. So we have what we call our bulky interface study where you can imagine our phones are just super easy now to just snap photos, but there's other types of cameras that are less easy to use, that they really put more of a barrier between you and the experience. And in that way, if it's about engagement and that's creating a barrier, then we wouldn't expect the same effects there. So we manipulate that in our study and show that the positive effect of photo taking is diminished or even disappears the more distracting the photo interface is. So if it's, bulky or, it kind of causes like I said, a barrier between you and the experience, then that really takes away from the ability of photos to enhance your enjoyment. So that really speaks to the engagement process. We also look at, when you are engaged in an experience already. So, you can imagine that the photo taking engages you, and that's a really insightful finding for anybody who's been to something really boring before and thinking about how photo taking can draw you in and enhance. That's cool. But what if you're already engaged or, involved in the experience? And so that's where we have this craft study where people are either observing like a craft person making something or they're doing the craft themselves. If you're doing the craft yourself, you're already engaged, and photo taking in that case does not enhance enjoyment. It might even detract in some situations. Think about that as, all the people who think, photo taking is taking us out of experiences are probably thinking a lot of the times about these types of situations where, they're engaged in a conversation and they're very immersed. And so photo taking really does, interrupt. But, where much of our life exists is in these kind of spaces where we're also just observing the world and watching, things pass us or, walking down the street and see something interesting. That's where photo taking can really be beneficial, not necessarily in a time when we're engaged in something else. And then the last study is looking at when photo taking can be harmful. And again, if it's about engagement, if photo taking is engaging us more, that enhances positive experiences. But if you're engaged more in a negative experience, then that should actually hurt. And so that's where we show that, with these kind of gruesome safari experiences where people are seeing, the bad parts of the wild, that photo taking of something like that actually makes people enjoy their experience less. And so, again, to your earlier point that, it's not like there's one, universal claim you can make from all of this, or that it's all good or all bad. Here we show that photo taking can harm people's experiences, and something that, might not have been as bad gets worse because the photo taking really causes you to attend to those visual details more. So that's kind of where we look at the engagement process in a bunch of different ways. And, we kind of just say these are moderators, these are boundary conditions.
That's interesting to me, Alex. And I guess as a clinical psychologist, I was really interested in that last study. And I guess we have, a whole bunch of citizen reporters out there now with smartphones that are capable of recording things that we just couldn't even think about even 5-10 years ago. By the sheer ubiquity of these devices, we're going to be capturing and attending to these terrible events that are going on in our communities that go on every day, road traffic accidents, whatever it is that we're thinking about. And we're going to be looking at them and attending to them in ways that we perhaps wouldn't have done beforehand. And I wonder about what the impacts of that might be for those people experiencing that, but also for those people who then are also sharing in that experience through distribution on social media and other platforms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought about it the other day, walking down the streets of New York, and there's a bunch of fire trucks, and you see everyone kind of craning their necks to try to figure out what's going on. People want to document and capture things, partly to prove that it happened. If there's no photo, then it didn't happen, I think is a lot of people's perspective. I think your point is a good one, that to the extent that our world isn't all positive or even all neutral all the time, that if we're attending more to visual details that aren't positive or are nice looking, that could be harmful. And then to your point about the sharing part, I totally agree that there's a downside that also comes from being always always thinking about how your photos are going to look to others. And so another paper that we have on this really looks at that part of the process and how attending to the self-presentational part, and how is this photo going to look to others, kind of what I mentioned earlier from my abroad experience, that some of the negative came from thinking about the anxiety of how is this going to look to others. That is something that can really detract from, again, the positive effects of photo taking can be diminished, or perhaps even go the other way, where you find negative effects from photo taking because you're thinking about the other things, the aspects that are not about the experience, about capturing something in a way that will present yourself in a particular light. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's what I was thinking about, because actually taking photos, but then sharing them as well, are acts of construction of self. So it's not just about the enjoyment of the experience that you're going through, but it's also a representation and processing and perhaps a reflection of who am I as a person? What is it that I'm interested in, and sharing with other people?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and we call it the curation process, and a lot of people already know, that we spend a lot of time curating our presence on social media. A lot of other researchers have studied that, and I think that our photo taking paper really just suggests that process can be even stronger when you're capturing photos, because photos are, less easy to alter. I can just tell you about my really great experience, and I can exaggerate, and I can, it's easy to talk, but when we're taking photos, it becomes more concrete and it becomes harder to alter. And so we get really, really obsessed with getting the perfect shot. And so that could be harmful, I think, for us moving forward.
There's a couple of open questions that you have. I just want to pick up on a couple. One you've written about in your paper, and that's the number of photos taken. And I guess that for me is also around the time proportion taken in terms of taking photos when you're actually doing something engaging in an experience. What were your thoughts around that? How do you think that might influence things?
Yeah, it makes sense. I've been, we all of my co-authors and I, we've always been wanting to show a boundary of number of photos taken, that, when you take more photos, you spend more time on it, at some point it's got to get in the way when we're taking thousands of photos on our vacations. We have tried very hard to show that in the lab. We haven't really found a boundary, at least in our laboratory studies. I mean, these are short experiences though, so we're not able to go yet into, somebody's like spring break experience where they go for a week and come back with, 100,000 photos. So I think there probably is a boundary there. It's just that, with our methods, the way, where they are right now, we haven't really been able to document it. But if you think about engagement and all of the things we've already talked about here, then it would make sense that at some point photo taking is going to detract. We haven't been able to show it. And it's just a very powerful effect that photos, even if you take 100 or, it's really good for people. It draws them in. Yeah. So maybe just, keep doing what you're doing.
The other question that I had going through my mind, be interested in your thoughts on it, is how much do you think this is a generational cohort effect? Is there, does a previous history of taking many photos whilst you're going through an experience map onto your findings? So perhaps it might be that those people who are maybe 50 or 60 who haven't experienced the last 10 years of really taking a lot of photos and perhaps didn't take so many photos in the past, how does that map onto this?
Yeah, that's a good question. We are definitely interested in the age aspect and cohorts and generations. And we have, there's two different aspects of that. One is, what are people's intuitions? And we find that definitely people in older generations have a stronger intuition against the, positives of photo taking, that they think photo taking is harmful. In our studies and in the paper we've been mostly focusing on here, we have not found differences in age, that even for older people who have these stronger beliefs against photo taking, that they still get they get a lot of these benefits. It makes them more engaged and oftentimes enjoy their experience more. Where we do find differences on age is with the sharing process. So for older people, it's not the case that sharing photos comes with the same kind of level of curation that we now have with social media and Instagram. That sharing for older people tends to mean more with family and friends and people who are less likely to be judging us, or they're not thinking about all of the likes and the comments and all of the things that younger generations are. So so we do have a study actually that looks at age explicitly and shows that the negative effects of taking photos to share is reduced or diminished completely, or is completely gone for older people. They don't get stressed about sharing, and that's probably because for them sharing is different. But where we see the effects most strongly are for those millennials who are really used to, getting that perfect shot, curating their life on social media. And that's something that, when I talk about my findings, my students and everybody can really relate to, because it's just something that is part of their world. And that's the piece that I find to be, more strongly correlated with age. And so it's not the photo taking itself, but the sharing process that really matters for age.
Sure. So, Alex, apart from tech companies who are going to be, bending over backwards to remove barriers for people taking photos and to increase the sharing capability of them, who should care about this research? Why, what's the point? Why should we be paying attention to this?
Right. Yeah. So definitely, being in a marketing department, I oftentimes have to talk about the companies and why they should care. But I actually prefer the other side of the question that you're asking. I think it's really about consumers and consumer welfare and just people more generally. I think that just thinking about the way that we all live our lives, these findings are really informative. That it's not, again, back to our earlier discussion, it's not about what's good or bad, should I take photos or not? It's more, what are my goals in this particular experience, and how should that drive my decision to take photos or not? So if my goal is, let's say I'm in a foreign country and it's, I'm not able to speak the language. So I'm not already engaged in something, or a conversation. I'm just observing. I want to take in my surroundings, and photo taking can really be beneficial for you as a consumer, as an individual. If you're at a concert or at a restaurant where you don't necessarily care what, the stage looks like or what the food looks like, but you really want to hear the music or taste the food, then you might want to put your phone away, because we know that by focusing on the visual details from the photo taking action, then you're less likely to remember or attend to these other details that might be more important for the experience. And of course, it matters whether you're, taking photos for yourself to remember forever or to share. And so what I always recommend for those who do care about posting on Instagram, that to the extent that you can really try to activate that goal after the experience is over, when you already have the photos and you're choosing which photo to post, then that can actually lead to less anxiety during the experience. And so you can really, as an individual, change the way that you enjoy things by trying to just, immerse yourself, take the photos without, taking 70 million of them to get the best shot in the moment. Take a few. Your photo's probably going to be fine for social media. Choose that later. Activate the goal later. And we find that when you activate the goal after the experience, it doesn't retroactively change what you remember or how much you enjoy it. So it's nice if you can just, live your life in the moment, take photos for your personal memories, and then later on activate the sharing goal.
As you're talking, you're very much reminding me of something I scrawled on the paper, is how is this linked to the concept of mindfulness? Because you're talking a lot about, this idea of, multi-sensory immersion in an experience, and how photos can perhaps take away from that. You have a very visual experience, but as you say, understanding what your goal is around taking the photo. So it's much more around how you take the photos rather than the activity of taking the photo itself, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it speaks back to that mental photo study where, it's really not about the act at all. It's about just how you're engaging with your environment. And so I can push a button, and that's not doing, it's not changing my enjoyment, but it's about what I'm attending to, what I'm processing, what are my goals, what are my higher level goals for doing this action. That's kind of the psychology behind it. It's not, it's not a physical effect. It's a psychological effect.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you found that conversation interesting. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing as well. There's plenty more in my back catalogue and plenty more to come on psychology, travel, photography, gear, videography, you name it. Check out the playlist and you'll see what I mean. Coming up right now. Thanks again, and go well.